Hey guys, tonight we step gently into a world where time seems to slow down and the simple act of sipping tea carries a quiet power you probably never imagined. Picture yourself in a softly lit 18th century drawing room, the faint clink of porcelain, the gentle aroma of steeped leaves curling through the air like a whispered invitation. You probably won't survive this with your usual caffeine buzz, because honestly, this is the opposite of frantic. It's a slow dance of ritual and calm. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below with your location and local time, because wherever you are, this peaceful journey will reach you like a warm, slow hug. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the fog of modern life back into the early days, when the tea was just beginning to weave itself into European aristocratic culture. Originally steeped in ancient China, tea made its way west via the Silk Road, slipping slowly into the elite salons of England by the mid-17th century. By the 18th century, it wasn't just a beverage, it was a statement of status, calm, and civility. Imagine the clatter of horse-drawn carriages outside contrasted with the hushed tones inside these early tea rooms. The ritual began humbly with leaves imported at great cost, brewed carefully in small kitchens or servants' quarters. Unlike the quick gulp you might take today, tea back then was savored with measured patience, a kind of slow luxury you might think was invented just to combat the otherwise bustling pace of Georgian society. Historians still argue whether tea truly became a symbol of female social empowerment or was simply a new way to enforce class distinctions. Either way, its cultural roots run deep. Curiously, early European tea drinkers often added ingredients like lavender or rosemary, trying to mimic the complex flavors known from Asian blends. Some even believed tea had medicinal properties that could calm nerves or aid digestion, which probably helped justify those long, lingering tea times. And here's a quirky tidbit: some nobles kept their own personal tea gardeners to cultivate exotic herbs, turning tea preparation into a mini botanical obsession. As you lean back, almost tasting the faint bitterness softened by a hint of honey or lemon, it's clear this was more than a drink. It was a pause button on the frantic rhythms of 18th century life, a moment carved out for quiet connection and reflection. You find yourself now inside a bustling London tea house, where the air buzzes softly with polite conversation and the rustle of silk gowns. The year is somewhere in the early 1700s, and tea is no longer just a rare luxury, but becoming a beloved social habit. Unlike today's grab-and-go culture, tea time is an event, a calm interlude amid the clamorous city streets and smoky chimneys. Imagine the subtle clink of silver spoons stirring sugar cubes, the delicate porcelain cups painted in indigo and gold resting on lace doilies. You probably won't survive this section without picturing yourself in a powdered wig or a corset, so get ready for some seriously formal sipping. Yet despite the ceremony, tea houses serve as surprisingly democratic spaces where different classes mingle, though never quite on equal footing. Here, merchants discuss business, while ladies gossip softly about the latest fashions or politics, all while the hot amber liquid steeps and swirls. Tea houses also became hotbeds of political discourse, sometimes quite literally. The government viewed them as suspicious gatherings, fearing they might spark rebellion or spread dissent. You'd be surprised to know that in 1675, King Charles II tried to close down London's coffee houses, and by extension, many tea houses, because they were breeding grounds for what he called seditious talk. Historians still argue whether tea houses truly fueled revolutionary ideas or if the paranoia was just royal overreach. On a quirkier note, tea was often served alongside delicate pastries and biscuits. But did you know that the humble biscuit's origins as a tea accompaniment trace back to naval provisions. These hard, twice-baked breads were practical for long sea voyages, but soon transformed into elegant tea-time treats. Some of the finest bakers crafted elaborate sweets meant to complement tea's bitterness, turning tea time into a multisensory experience. As you sip your imagined cup, feel the warmth spread slowly, the peaceful atmosphere, a sharp contrast to the roaring world outside. Here, tea is both a comfort and a quiet rebellion against chaos, a small, soothing act that threads through the fabric of daily life. You drift now into the delicate art of tea preparation itself, a ritual as refined as any courtly dance in the 18th century. Picture a finely carved wooden table adorned with silver kettles and porcelain teapots painted with delicate russet and teal patterns. The water is brought just to the boil, the leaves, carefully measured, usually black teas from China, prized for their bold flavor, and steeped in the pot, releasing their fragrant, smoky tendrils. You probably won't survive this section without learning that tea was once so expensive and rare that people treated it almost like medicine. The British even imported special tea chests, airtight wooden boxes, lined with paper and sealed with lead, to keep the precious leaves fresh on their months-long journey from the Far East. It's strange to think that today we just dump a tea bag in hot water and call it a day. An odd bit of history here: some wealthy households employed tea tasters, specialists, who would sample each batch to ensure it wasn't poisoned or of inferior quality. After all, tea wasn't just about taste, but trust, particularly in a time when food safety was a gamble. Imagine that as your job title, professional tea taster. Not a bad gig, though it might have been a bit nerve-wracking. Historians still argue whether the famed British obsession with black tea started purely from health concerns, as it was thought to aid digestion and calm nerves, or if it was driven by the sheer novelty and exoticism of the brew. Either way, the tea ritual came with a set of social rules, like how long to steep, which cups to use, and who poured the first cup, reflecting class distinctions and gender roles that could make your head spin. On the fringe side, some believed that tea had magical properties. It was rumored to awaken creativity, sharpen the mind, and even ward off evil spirits. Though the evidence for these claims is thankfully as weak as a well-diluted cup. As you savor this imagined brewing scene, the steam curling upward like a whispered secret, you're reminded how tea was more than a drink. It was a gentle, structured ceremony that wove calm and order into the rhythm of everyday life. You find yourself next in a cozy, softly lit tea room, somewhere in Georgian England, the afternoon sun casting a warm saffron glow over the delicate lace curtains. Here the ritual moves beyond preparation and into the art of serving, the careful pouring of tea into dainty porcelain cups, each edged with gilded flourishes and painted with tiny indigo blossoms. The sound of silver teaspoons gently stirring, the clink of fine china, and the faint scent of bergamot from the Earl Grey blend fill the air. Tea was a social event, a quiet but essential pause in the bustle of daily life, especially for women who gathered to exchange gossip, politics, and poetry between sips. You probably won't survive the details of the elaborate etiquette surrounding tea drinking. Never slurp, never stir clockwise, and always hold your pinky finger down. No raised pinkies allowed, despite what cartoons say. These rules weren't just about manners, but about showing your place in society's careful hierarchy. Quirky fact: some hosts would hire tea lady servants devoted solely to the care and replenishment of tea, sometimes armed with a silver tray and a sweet smile, as well as a sharp ear for the latest news. Tea rooms were also among the earliest public social spaces women could frequent without a male chaperone, a small but important step in social independence. Historians still argue whether tea culture contributed to the early stirrings of the British feminist movement by creating spaces for women's intellectual exchange, or if it simply reinforced existing class divides under a thin veneer of civility. On the fringe, certain upper-class circles believed that the quality of tea served could reflect the moral character of the host, turning a simple cup into a test of virtue or even spiritual purity. It's hard to imagine today, but in those delicate moments over steaming cups, the fate of reputations could be quietly sealed. You lean back now, imagining the soft murmur of polite conversation, the gentle clatter of tea sets, and the peaceful calm that these rituals wove into everyday life, a comforting rhythm amid the chaotic world beyond the windows. You step into a bustling colonial port city where the scent of fresh spices mixes with salty sea air and tea chests from China are stacked high in warehouses. The story here shifts to the global trade networks that made 18th century tea culture possible, a vast complex web linking continents through ships, merchants, and often brutal labor. Imagine creaky wooden docks where sailors unload barrels of tea leaves wrapped carefully in rice paper and bundled into woven baskets for shipment inland. This tea isn't just a luxury for the aristocrats anymore. It's becoming a staple, gradually trickling down through different social classes. You trudge alongside traders, their tongues thick with accents, from London to Canton, their pockets full of silver and stories of storms at sea. Tea smuggling was rampant too, as heavy taxes on tea led to underground markets thriving in shadowy taverns and back alleys. Smugglers risked everything just to keep the tea flowing and the government guessing. A quirky tidbit, some smugglers disguised tea in everything from barrels of salted fish to crates labeled dried herbs, proving that the underground tea trade had its own code of silent nods and secret compartments. You might also find tea leaves hidden in women's clothing folds during customs checks, a risky game of hide and sip. Historians still argue whether the British obsession with tea helped kickstart the Industrial Revolution by encouraging productivity and punctual breaks, or if it was simply an excuse for the empire's expanding reach into Asia and its exploitative practices. On the fringe, a few merchants believed that tea held mystical healing powers beyond simple refreshment, linking the bitter brew to ancient Chinese medicine and spiritual balance, a belief that partially fueled the demand and mythos around tea in Europe. You pause, hearing the distant creak of sails and the murmur of a crowd eager to taste the new exotic leaves. This was no mere drink, but a catalyst, weaving together worlds, economies, and lives, one humble cup at a time. You sit cross-legged on a straw mat, the floor beneath you smooth and cool, faintly smelling of sandalwood. The door is open to a quiet garden, and on a low lacquered table sits a small porcelain cup of steaming tea, its aroma delicate, floral, almost ancient. Welcome to the East. Tonight, you're a guest in an 18th century Chinese scholar's tea room, where every gesture, every movement in the brewing ritual is deliberate and steeped literally in centuries of tradition. Tea in China isn't just a beverage, it's philosophy, medicine, and art. You watch as water is heated to exactly the right temperature, not too hot, not too cool, and poured over loose leaves with a grace that borders on performance. This is Gong Fu tea preparation, a meticulous style that elevates tea from a drink to a meditative act. And yes, if you're wondering, it takes far longer than popping a tea bag into a mug, but also it smells 1,000 times better. Mainstream history reminds us that China was the original cradle of tea cultivation. The Camellia sinensis plant has been growing here for thousands of years, long before it ever reached British lips. Chinese farmers in the 1700s mastered selective cultivation, fermenting techniques, and drying methods that allowed them to create green oolong and black teas with astonishing consistency, despite never having a spreadsheet or a Starbucks rewards card. A quirky note: some tea connoisseurs in Qing, China, reportedly preferred spring water taken from dew collected off lotus leaves. Historians have found references to tea brewed with snowmelt mountain mist and even the first rainwater of autumn, which somehow sounds poetic and ridiculous at the same time. And yet historians still argue whether the deeply ceremonial style of Chinese tea brewing in this period influenced European tea habits, or if Europeans simply admired the aesthetics while doing their own hurried, milk-heavy thing. There's evidence both ways. Some elite British homes featured Chinese-style teaware and mimicked the layout of Chinese tea rooms. Others, meanwhile, were busy stuffing sugar cubes into cups like it was a sweet tooth contest. You sip the tea, your hands mimic the host's careful movements, and you notice how time slows down. Conversations become softer. There's no hurry. Tea here is a portal, a rhythm, a quiet rebellion against the frenzy of the outside world. The room hums with stillness broken only by the subtle splash of hot water meeting porcelain. Out in the fields beyond the cities, tea pickers move methodically through neat rows of bushes, pinching 2 leaves and a bud with practiced fingers. It's quiet work, repetitive and largely invisible to those sipping tea in urban pavilions, but their labor, along with the farmers who dry and roll the leaves by hand, fuels the entire culture. Without them, the ceremonies would be empty cups. And so you sit warmed by the tea and by the low lantern light flickering on the rice paper walls. No one rushes you here. Time steeps just like the leaves. You feel a stillness settle into your bones, a kind of sacred monotony, gentle, precise, and oddly sleepy. Outside the formal tea rooms of scholars and nobles, you shuffle down a narrow street in 18th century Guangzhou, brushing shoulders with peddlers' children and sleep-deprived cats. This is the tea of the people, boisterous, steaming, and deeply democratic. Here tea doesn't float on a porcelain cloud, it clinks in cups, spills on tables, and perfumes alleyways with jasmine and charcoal smoke. You enter a bustling tea house just after dawn. It's already half full, old men playing Weiqi merchants mumbling over ledgers, and travelers drowsily sipping their morning brew. The server weaves between low tables with surprising grace, balancing kettles that hiss like kettle drums. He slaps down a pot and clatters tiny cups like a percussionist in silk slippers. This is where the less refined but no less important tea culture thrives. No slow ceremonies here, just the practical use of tea as a stimulant, a social glue, and occasionally a way to politely delay the start of your workday. In these tea houses, oolong is king-strong, earthy, and poured over and over from cracked clay pots whose interiors are seasoned from years of use, kind of like your favorite cast-iron skillet, but more fragrant and with fewer fried eggs. Mainstream history confirms that these neighborhood tea houses were the beating heart of urban communities. They weren't just cafes, they were newsrooms, matchmaking hubs, impromptu poetry salons, and early morning therapy sessions. Some even doubled as places for job seekers to meet potential employers or for gamblers to scope out their next lucky spot. A strange fringe tidbit, some tea houses kept crickets in tiny bamboo cages, not for food but for entertainment. Patrons would bet on their chirps or simply enjoy the oddly calming soundtrack. It's like a white noise machine, but with wings and legs. Historians still argue whether these working-class tea houses actually influenced larger social movements, or if they were just background noise in the broader narrative of Qing-era politics. Did casual conversation here subtly shape revolutions? Did secret societies plot over tea-stained menus? Some scholars say yes. Others sip their tea and shrug. Your teacup is refilled before it's even empty, a practiced move from a server who hasn't made eye contact in 20 minutes. There's a rhythm here, loud, fast, yet oddly cozy. The room smells like roast peanuts, worn bamboo, and dried orange peel, a scent so specific it might as well be bottled and labeled Guangzhou Tuesday. The regulars never finish a full pot. That's part of the magic. Tea leaves are reused, steeped again and again. The bitterness mellows much like the conversation, and even when someone gets into a loud debate about grain prices, it all ends in laughter. or at least an exaggerated slurp. Outside, the street hums louder now. Vendors are hawking buns, the sun creeps above the tiled rooftops, and you feel something warm settle in your chest. Tea doesn't need to be sacred. Sometimes it just needs to be hot, shared, and available by the potful. And as you step back into the alley, you realize you've been here long enough to forget what time it is. But that's the charm. You don't drink tea to race the clock. You drink it to escape it. You follow the scent of damp earth and polished wood into a quieter world, now one lined with orderly hedges and gravel paths. Welcome to the refined gardens and tea pavilions of Edo period Japan. The pace slows dramatically here, like switching from sprinting down a market street to wading through still water. You arrive just before the sun reaches its peak, and the tea master is already there, raking the sand in deliberate strokes. You bow, he bows deeper, and just like that, you're inside the rhythm of the ritual. Here, tea isn't simply drunk, it's witnessed. Everything is intentional. From the way the bamboo ladle lifts the water to the slow fold of the silk cloth used to cleanse the tea bowl. If you blink too fast, you might miss the entire ceremony. That's okay. The point is not speed. The point is harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. 4 simple words that somehow require years of study and a lifetime of patience to embody fully. A mainstream fact to ground you. The Japanese tea ceremony, or shanoyu, evolved under the influence of Zen Buddhism. It emphasized minimalism, introspection, and the idea that a fleeting moment like a shared bowl of matcha could reflect the whole universe. No pressure. And then there's the weird, almost whimsical detail. Some tea practitioners would host chaji ceremonies lasting 4 hours or more, during which they served a multi-course meal, burned incense, and performed carefully choreographed gestures that could be mistaken for interpretive dance. If interpretive dance involved a whisk and a half bow every 10 seconds. You sip your thick, frothy matcha, and it's not sweet. It never is. But it tastes like something older than you, greener than you thought possible, and definitely more serious than your last cup of oolong in that noisy Cantonese tea house. This tea wants you to think. So you do. Historians still argue whether the ceremony was more about spiritual practice or social display. Was it an artful way to empty your mind, or a highbrow method of flaunting your ceramic collection and rare tea leaves? Maybe it was both. Maybe that contradiction is part of its charm. The tea master raises his eyebrows slightly, and you remember your cue. Rotate the cup, sip in silence, then admire the bowl's artistry, as if it contains the secret to the cosmos. Because maybe it does, or maybe you're just slightly caffeine-deprived and in need of a snack. Outside, the garden murmurs. A breeze flutters through maple leaves, and the rustle feels choreographed, as if nature is part of the performance. Even the shadows fall neatly between stepping stones. Somewhere nearby, a hidden waterfall trickles politely, as if to say, "No need to rush." You realize something important here. This isn't just about the tea. It's about slowing time down to the speed of breath. It's about appreciating the steam rising from a bowl with the same reverence you'd give to a sunrise. It's about letting the world shrink to the width of your fingertips for a while. Later, as the ceremony draws to a close, you walk back along the path. Your socks pick up a little gravel. The gate creaks, a lantern sways. And though you've barely spoken, you feel like you've had a conversation, one between leaf and water, between hand and clay, between silence and understanding. Not bad for a cup of bitter green foam. You wander back west now, back to Europe, where the year is 1773, and the streets of London are damp with rain and rumor. The city hums with the low growl of horse-drawn carts and the occasional squawk of a disoriented goose. But you're not interested in chaos right now. You're following the aroma of bergamot toast and scandal. You duck into a tea shop, not one of those quaint, lace-draped ones from the movies, but a bustling, smoky room filled with chatter-powdered wigs and the rustle of newspapers hot off the press. Welcome to the age of British tea drinking, where the act of sipping a cuppa is rapidly evolving from aristocratic pastime to nationwide obsession. Mainstream history tells us the 18th century marked the explosion of tea culture in Britain. Tea had been around for decades, but it was now accessible to more than just the elite. By the 1770s, you didn't need a title or a manor to enjoy a brew. You just needed a few pence, a chipped cup, and maybe a few crumpets if you were lucky. A peculiar fringe tidbit: some tea shops in London were used as fronts for covert meetings. Not by revolutionaries exactly, but by writers, debtors, and philosophers dodging their landladies or debating whether sugar was morally acceptable. One tea shop was rumored to be frequented by a talking parrot who could mimic the Prime Minister's voice. We don't know if this is true, but we choose to believe it anyway. The British approach to tea was more casual than Japan's meditative ceremony or China's philosophical steeping. Here it was about conversation, gossip, and, yes, colonial wealth. Because no matter how delicately someone lifted their saucer, there was always an empire hiding beneath the teapot lid. Historians still argue whether British tea culture truly democratized the beverage, or merely shifted its exclusivity from one class to another. After all, while you could buy cheap tea, the best blends, and certainly the fanciest silver tea sets, were still signs of social standing. You sit near the window, the glass is foggy from the steam of 20 kettles. A lady in a bonnet discusses French fashion with more passion than politics, while two merchants in the corner are already 3 cups deep and arguing about molasses tariffs. No one seems in a hurry. The tea, despite its exotic origins, has become something comfortingly British, a pause button in liquid form. The server pours you a second cup, this time with milk, a newfangled habit that's catching on, although purists still scoff. Sugar, however, is more controversial. Imported via the transatlantic trade, it sweetens countless cups but leaves a bitter ethical aftertaste that no one at your table really wants to talk about. And here's the truth: tea didn't just soothe nerves, it also stirred debates. Tea taxes, tea theft, even tea riots. This innocent little leaf had become so valuable that it sparked smuggling rings and contributed to one of the most infamous acts of protest across the Atlantic. But that's a tale brewing for another section. For now, you settle into your wooden chair, your ankles slightly damp from the rain, your saucer warm in your hand. The candle flickers, the street outside drips, and for a few minutes, over sips of black tea with just the right amount of milk, the world seems manageable. The scent of Darjeeling fades as you find yourself slipping sideways across oceans and into sun-drenched India, where the British East India Company has its grip not just on trade, but increasingly on the land itself. You're perched on a shady veranda in the hills of Assam, swatting at a mosquito and watching something miraculous and mildly bureaucratic unfold: the birth of the Indian tea industry. Now you're used to imagining tea as something dainty, something you sip while gossiping about who wore what to the Duchess's ball. But here in 18th century India, tea is about control, about plantations, about science, sweat, and soil. The British, after falling head over heels for tea, realized they could grow it themselves and cut out the awkward middleman that was China. The mainstream fact: British botanists and adventurers scoured Indian forests in the 1820s and 30s, eventually discovering wild tea plants growing in Assam. Yes, wild tea, just chilling there, ignored for centuries. It's like finding a bottle of wine in your backyard and deciding to start a vineyard. The quirky tidbit: one early tea enthusiast tried to disguise himself as a Chinese monk to sneak into tea-growing regions of China and learn their secrets. He didn't succeed, but he did manage to get arrested multiple times. His name was Robert Fortune, yes, really. And historians still argue whether he actually contributed meaningful knowledge or just got a cool travel story out of it. Anyway, the British eventually succeeded in cultivating tea not just in Assam but in Darjeeling, Nilgiris, and other picturesque places where clouds hang low and elephants occasionally trample through the crops. They brought in workers, often poor locals, coerced or incentivized under grim terms, and imposed a strict regimen of planting, plucking, and processing. Tea growing wasn't exactly glamorous work. It was grueling, but the empire ran on it. You lean against the wooden rail of the plantation manager's bungalow. Inside, someone is fussing over the leaf rollers. Outside, barefoot workers in simple tunics are hunched over rows of glossy green bushes, plucking with a rhythm that's both methodical and meditative. You hear laughter, soft, cautious, and realize the tea industry, though built on a backbone of colonialism, also became a community in its own right. Each day ends the same, with a batch of leaves, sorted, withered, oxidized, and fired into something that smells like autumn and comfort and empire. You sample the results. It's bracing, stronger than the stuff in London, maybe a little bitter with a hint of citrus and colonial guilt. And then there's the auctions. Huge ones. Imagine bustling rooms in Calcutta or London, where men in crisp white suits debate leaf grades and flavor profiles the way modern folks argue about crypto. They speak in code BOOPFOFTGFIA, which stands for finest tippy golden flowery orange pico, in case you thought tea terminology wasn't extra. This is the language of power disguised as taste. Of course, locals had been brewing their own teas for ages, especially among certain tribal communities in Assam. But now, thanks to British industrialism, the production scale was excessive. Some scholars argue this was the moment tea shifted permanently into a global commodity. Others say it was simply the inevitable result of obsession paired with colonial infrastructure and free labor. Either way, your little teacup now comes with a complex backstory. As you sip again, the sun lowers, the hills turn gold, the air cools. A cart rolls past laden with fresh bundles of leaves, destined for drying racks. A dog barks at nothing. You realize that what started as an elegant tradition in Asia has now become something else entirely: massive, mechanical, and money-making. And yet it's still comforting, still ritualistic, still somehow intimate. You brush a stray tea leaf from your sleeve. It's sticky with dew and smells like everything you've ever needed to slow down. Your journey wafts gently westward, and now you're nestled into a drawing room somewhere in Bath, or maybe Edinburgh, surrounded by the hum of low conversation, the clink of porcelain, and the occasional haughty cough. The year is somewhere around 1770-something, and you're witnessing the rise of one of tea's fancier side effects, the social ritual known simply as afternoon tea. Of course, technically, that doesn't exist yet, at least not in the highly stylized way you're picturing, with scones, finger sandwiches, and tiered trays precariously loaded with tiny food. That version won't really crystallize until the 19th century, thanks to the Duchess of Bedford and her deeply relatable mid-afternoon hunger pangs. But you're seeing the seeds being planted, both literally and socially. Here, in 18th century Britain, tea is still a luxury, but no longer rare. It's spreading into middle-class parlors and respectable tea rooms, becoming not just a beverage, but an excuse to gather gossip and gently judge one another's taste in biscuits. The mainstream historical fact, tea, gradually moved from apothecaries and elite gatherings into everyday domestic life. Merchants began importing it in larger quantities, and the British government, ever the opportunist, slapped it with hefty taxes. That led to smuggling. A lot of muggling. You sip your tea and pretend not to notice the neighbor's suspiciously full canister of Dutch breakfast blend. Now for the quirky tidbit, in some households they kept tea locked in special tea caddies with tiny keys guarded like treasure chests. Only the lady of the house had the key because, heaven forbid, the servants helped themselves to a cup. It's not quite the great heist of '73, but it does make a morning brew feel like opening a vault. You nibble on something stale but sweet, likely a bit of seed cake, and listen as your host chats about weather, the price of lace, and whether her cousin's tea garden will ever bloom properly. She says this last bit as if she actually owns a tea plantation, not a few geraniums in a chipped watering can. The conversation is decorous, filled with careful pauses, and those tiny, polite laughs that only say I'm vaguely amused, but mostly, I'm judging your hemline. Still, you have to admit there's something soothing about it all. The rhythm, the refinement, the ever so slightly caffeinated civility. Historians still argue whether these tea rituals were empowering for women, creating semi-public spaces for conversation and influence, or whether they just reinforced domestic expectations in a more elegant teacup. Probably both. The patriarchy rarely forgets to stir in a little lemon. The tea itself, often green, surprisingly. Black tea didn't dominate British preferences until later in the 19th century, but even now, tastes are shifting. People experiment with milk, with sugar, with spices. Someone across the room is raving about a new blend they tried at Vauxhall Gardens. It includes orange peel and something called gunpowder. You nod and try not to sound alarmed. And, of course, there are tea accessories. Tiny spoons, silver strainers, bone china cups with impossibly delicate handles, made specifically to make you nervous. Some ladies carry their own teaspoons in velvet-lined cases because nothing says I'm superior to you like personalized cutlery. But it's not just a British thing anymore. Tea's rise as a social glue starts to echo across Europe. In Parisian salons, tea coexists with coffee in a whirlwind of powdered wigs and philosophical debate. In Russia, tea begins its long, smoky affair with samovars and spoonfuls of jam. Globalization is slow and often a little bit awkward, but tea is a unifying force, warm, fragrant, and increasingly hard to resist. As you settle deeper into your chair, you feel the room relax. The fire pops gently. A maid clears the cups. Someone sighs. There's a lull, the kind that only comes when caffeine begins to fade and conversation trails off into shared silence. And just like that, tea has done its job. It's stitched together a brief hour of calm, of curated elegance, of whispered alliances and perfectly timed laughter. You stand, nod politely, and pocket a leftover biscuit. For later, of course. This stuff is expensive. You've lingered in drawing rooms and plantations long enough now. You drift quietly into the cluttered backrooms of 18th century apothecaries where tea shares shelf space with powdered rhubarb root and jars of leeches. You're surrounded by amber bottles and the faint aroma of crushed herbs. And suddenly your cup of tea isn't just a beverage anymore, it's medicine. Here in this world of powdered substances and whispered ailments, tea is prescribed as a gentle remedy for everything from headaches to hysteria. You pick up a small pamphlet, the paper dry and thin as onion skin, and it lists the manifold virtues of bohea tea in solemn looping script. You read with amusement that it cheers the spirits, clears the mind, and mildly warms the blood. You know, just in case your humors were feeling a little chilly. The mainstream historical fact here, tea genuinely was treated as a medicinal substance in the 17th and 18th centuries. Physicians recommended it for digestion, melancholy, even to loosen the bowels, which, depending on the steeping strength, was either accurate or extremely accurate. Quirky tidbit. Some doctors insisted that only weak tea had health benefits. Strong tea, they warned, might overstimulate the nervous system and lead to a weary trembling of the limbs, which sounds suspiciously like caffeine jitters, 18th century edition. One pamphlet even blamed oversteeped tea for a woman's sudden melancholy and tendency to read too many novels. Tragic. Historians still argue whether this medicinal framing was a genuine belief or simply an upper-class excuse to spend money on a product imported with imperial markup. Either way it worked, tea took on a new layer of purpose. It became a comfort in illness, a ritual in grief, and an everyday luxury disguised as therapy. You sit beside a woman with a lingering cough, watching her cradle a steaming teacup as though it contains salvation. She sips with closed eyes. Maybe it's just hot water with leaves, but right now it's doing something. You feel the warmth in your own hands and let it spread slowly through your chest. Is it curing anything? Who knows? But it's helping. Across town in a grander parlor, a gentleman doctor dramatically discusses the morbid effects of overindulgence in foreign infusions. His voice is syrupy with self-importance. You note that he's sipping from a rather large cup himself, filled with exactly what he warns against. Naturally. And it's not just tea in the spotlight here, it's what you add to it. Sugar, for instance, heavily debated, heavily taxed, and deeply tied to colonial plantations in the Caribbean. Is sugar a medicinal additive or an indulgent danger? Depends on who's asking and who's profiting. You pass by a shelf of labeled jars and see other tea-adjacent favorites: dried orange peel ginger, root star anise. Apothecaries weren't just selling Camellia sinensis, they were curating experiences, cures, and caffeine all in one swoop. In a creaky chair, you read a leaflet claiming tea reduces swelling of the spleen. You're not entirely sure what a swollen spleen feels like, but you're definitely drinking another cup just to be safe. Outside the apothecary, a street hawker calls out, offering fine green leaf from the Orient sweet to the palate and gentle to the gut. His pitch is oddly soothing. You buy a small pouch wrapped in waxed paper, wondering if you've just purchased medicine contraband or dinner. Later that night, someone tells you tea should be taken lying down, that the true healing doesn't begin until you're tucked beneath a quilt, listening to the whistle of the kettle and the soft clink of china. You decide that's the most accurate medical advice you've heard all day. And in the growing quiet of evening, as the last apothecary shutters its door and the smell of peppermint tea lingers in the air, you begin to understand tea is as much about how it makes you feel as what it contains. A ritual of care, a placebo with flavor, a medicine cabinet wrapped in steam. You sip again and your spleen, whatever it's doing, feels just fine. The teacups have cooled and the apothecary door has shut, but your journey winds onward into quieter places, into libraries and diaries. The quiet corners of domestic life where tea's role takes on something gentler, something deeply routine. You ease into the 18th century English drawing room once more, not for political drama or class theater this time, but for comfort, rhythm, and repetition. Tea is no longer the scandalous import or suspicious cure, it's just part of life. You sit near the hearth where a cat dozes under a side table, its tail flicking with vague irritation at the crackle of the fire. A porcelain teapot rests on a cozy with floral embroidery, and someone's grandmother is steeping a second round without a hint of urgency. It smells faintly of bergamot and old wool. You don't speak. You don't need to. This is tea as background music, tea as wallpaper, quietly present, comforting as breath. Here comes your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1700s, tea had become a firmly embedded part of daily domestic routines in both aristocratic and increasingly middle-class homes. Morning tea, afternoon tea, tea before bed, every moment had its pot, its ritual, its spoonful of sugar. It was clockwork with caffeine. The quirky tidbit: children drank it too. Yes, kids, sometimes with more milk than tea, sometimes sweetened enough to make your molars hum, but they drank it right alongside their parents. A toddler might be toddling with a miniature teacup, mimicking their governess. Tea parties weren't just pretend, they were training. Historians still argue whether this widespread consumption of tea helped democratize domestic routines, or merely reinforce the status symbols of refinement and leisure. After all, only certain households could afford the nice china or the constant coal to keep the water hot. You shuffle through a stack of old letters and read one from a young woman in Bath writing to her cousin. She complains not about war or disease or social status, but about the scandal of being served lukewarm tea at a guest's house. It was as though my tongue were punished, she writes, and my hostess saw no crime in it. A national emergency, clearly. In another diary, a quiet widow writes that her afternoon tea was the one moment of peace in her day, when the world slowed and she could sit with her thoughts. I take it in my little blue cup, she notes, and I remember him. You let the quiet ache of that sentence wash over you. Tea becomes a placeholder for love, for loss, for all the things left unsaid. You notice now how specific everything is. The tray with polished silver tongs, the bowl of lump sugar, the rhythmic stir of the spoon against porcelain. There's a deliberate choreography to it all, the pouring, the sipping, the nod of approval when the steeping is just right. You don't need to speak the language, you can feel it in the silence. Some households have exact rules, clockwise stirring only. Milk after tea, never before. Never clink your spoon against the cup. Don't slurp, don't glug, don't let the spoon touch your lips. Break any of these rules and you might not be invited back. You're handed a biscuit, plain crumbly, not too sweet. It's designed to complement, not compete. It's called a tea cake, but it's not a cake and there's no tea in it. That's just how 18th century naming conventions work. Like calling a hat a bonnet even if it covers nothing. You munch politely. Outside the window, a delivery boy pedals past with a tin of fresh leaves strapped to his back. He's part of the silent machinery keeping these rituals alive. Somewhere a maid is refilling a kettle, timing everything to avoid smoke in the sitting room. And then there's the silence again. The kind that isn't empty, but full of small thoughts. You stare into your teacup and watch the leaves settle. Are they telling your fortune? Probably not, but they're telling a story of comfort, repetition, and warmth. By now, you realize the real magic of tea isn't in its leaves or even in its origin. It's in the pause. It's in making space for quiet moments between bigger things, a soft breath between words, a steaming cup between responsibilities. And if someone offers you another cup, you accept, not because you're thirsty, but because it means a few more minutes of stillness. So you sip. The cat stretches. A spoon tings softly against china, and the entire 18th century world seems just for a moment to exhale. The fire dims, but your eyelids remain just barely open, curious enough to continue, relaxed enough to surrender. You stay seated as the gentle rhythms of tea culture begin to fade from private parlors into public spaces, like a fog rolling across cobbled streets. If tea at home is personal, quiet, and familiar, then tea in the public sphere is, well, still quiet, still ritualized, but touched with a trace of performance and maybe a bit of eavesdropping. You shuffle forward now into the slightly noisier hum of the 18th century tea garden. Yes, those existed, and not just a patch of grass where someone sips Earl Grey under a parasol. No, this was a whole social operation. Outdoor pleasure gardens like Vauxhall or Ranelagh in London often had dedicated pavilions and ornate kiosks where visitors could order tea, stroll under lantern-lit hedges, listen to musicians, and carefully pretend they weren't people watching with deeply judgmental intensity. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid to late 18th century, tea gardens became immensely popular as semi-respectable venues where people of various classes, though still mostly the decent ones, could mingle in public under the guise of tea-sipping sophistication. You take a seat at one of the ironwork tables, carefully aligned along gravel paths beneath blooming lilacs. A server with suspiciously clean gloves places a delicate pot of Bohea black tea before you. There's a little sign saying "No rowdiness," and somehow the words feel like a threat. You take a sip. It's a little oversteeped, but you're not here for the flavor. You're here for the spectacle. A pair of ladies in towering wigs giggle behind gloved hands. A poet reads loudly to no one in particular. A group of gentlemen, obviously drunk but pretending not to be, argue about politics while balancing teacups and wearing expressions of forced composure. You meanwhile pretend to focus on the swan pond. Tea has become more than a beverage. It's a prop, something to do with your hands while engaging in gentle flirtation or making sharp observations disguised as pleasantries. The spoon swirls not just sugar, but gossip. The quirky tidbit, one of the more ridiculous trends, was the teaspoon snatcher young pranksters who would pocket silver spoons as souvenirs from prominent tea gardens. Some even bragged about their collections. One Londoner reportedly had over 50 and was known to wear one as a cravat pin. Subtle. Historians still argue whether these public tea spaces helped break down class barriers or simply gave the middle class a new stage on which to emulate aristocracy. After all, just because you're sipping oolong under a cherry tree doesn't mean society's invisible fences have disappeared. Some gardens, particularly the more elite ones, even charged higher prices for specific table placements. Want to sit under the pavilion where the Duke once spilled a cup? That'll cost you extra. Want to sit near the musicians? Pay up. There's no free refills here unless you're unusually charming or unusually rich. You spot a curious invention, porcelain travel tea sets built into small lacquered boxes with compartments for leaves, cups, strainers, and a fold-out tray. Like an 18th century picnic kit, but for refined hydration. People brought these to the gardens to show off, because of course, they did. The atmosphere is still calm, but it buzzes gently like a hive, dressed in lace and perfume. Conversations drift by like soft winds. Someone hums a tune under their breath. Someone else sketches trees with charcoal and exaggerates the elegance of passing strangers. A dog barks, a cup clinks, a judge's powdered wig nearly topples when he nods off mid-sip. But the gardens, lovely as they are, also carry whispers of something deeper, an early tentative step into the public social world for women, for the bourgeoisie, for anyone not part of the smoke-filled taverns or solemn coffeehouses. Tea is quiet, yes, but it makes room. It stretches social boundaries by inviting presence, one porcelain cup at a time. You lean back on your wrought iron chair. The sky darkens just enough to make the lanterns shimmer. Someone offers you another biscuit, and this time it's lemon-flavored, dusted in sugar, tiny and perfect. You realize you haven't said a word in 20 minutes, and you don't need to. Your participation is marked by your cup, your presence, and your stillness. You watch a young couple pretend not to be holding hands. You sip again, and the world spins quietly on beneath the blossoms beside the candlelight. A bell chimes in the distance, soft, metallic, probably decorative. It stirs something inside you, not wakefulness exactly, but a deeper kind of drowsy awareness. You rise from the tea garden with gentle limbs and drift into quieter corners of the 18th century tea world, places where tea is still present, still steeping, but the social theater has given way to reflection, ritual, and routine. Now you find yourself inside a modest countryside home. The floors creak underfoot. The windows are small and thick with condensation. A kettle whispers on the hearth. You sit down with a wooden cup, nothing fancy. This is no garden fete, no salon gathering. This is home. And tea here is not for showing off. It's for grounding. This is your final cup. By now, you've tasted it all. Green, black, spiced, perfumed, ceremonial, imported, overhyped, and overbrewed. And this somehow feels the most honest. Just a spoonful of leaves in hot water, steeped for a few minutes, sipped in silence. No powdered wigs, no porcelain, no judging glances, just warmth. Here's your final mainstream historical fact. By the close of the 18th century, tea was deeply embedded in daily life across Europe, especially in Britain. It was no longer just an elite trend, but a cultural staple found in the kitchens of shopkeepers and servants alike. Tea had won. And the quirky tidbit: some rural folks believed that tea could predict the weather. If it brewed too quickly, a storm was coming. If it turned pale, expect frost. Entire forecasts swirled in tiny ceramic cups. Meteorology meets myth, one steep at a time. Historians still argue whether tea's spread marked a true cultural democratization or simply replaced old hierarchies with new rituals, equally fussy and exclusionary. After all, replacing goblets of wine with teacups doesn't necessarily make a society more egalitarian, just more hydrated. You sit there now, knees close to the hearth, and notice the way the tea steam curls upward like a ribbon of thought. Everything has slowed. The fire crackles, the house sighs. A cat somewhere knocks over a tin and then pretends it wasn't them. You begin to trace back through it all the slow ships across choppy oceans, the stolen cuttings smuggled in boots, the courtships and controversies, the gardens and gossip. You recall how a single dried leaf, light as a whisper, carried with it centuries of trade theft philosophy and perfume. You remember the gentleman who insisted on stirring clockwise to bring luck, the woman who dropped rose petals into her teapot and called it moon water, the child who believed tea leaves were sleeping bugs. Everyone brings a little story to the kettle, and somehow across all that pomp, all that sugar and scandal, tea remained simple, quiet, patient. It waited to be poured, waited to be sipped, and even now it waits for you to finish. You do slowly, and with your final cup drained, the world softens once more. Now let your breath fall gently, like leaves settling at the bottom of a teacup. You've walked through time, through porcelain parlors and lantern-lit gardens, through gossip and empire and silence, and now you're here, safe, still, steeped in calm. The world outside can keep swirling, the clamor, the chatter, the ticking of clocks. It all quiets now like the hush that follows a bell's final chime. Your body is heavier, your thoughts lighter, as if you've been infused with stillness, that slow warmth of a cup held in two hands, that peace that comes not from answers, but from knowing you don't need any tonight. Let your muscles release their grip. Let your shoulders soften. If there's any tension left, imagine it drifting away on a curl of steam. The stories you've heard tonight don't demand anything of you. You don't need to remember who smuggled the seedlings or which tea house charged extra for a view. You don't even have to recall whether you laughed at the teaspoon thieves. It's all drift now, background, a gentle hum. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in your dreams, you'll find yourself seated again at a quiet wooden table, with the fire low, the cup full, and nothing left on the agenda but rest. No need to move, no need to speak, just let go and sleep.